A veteran's dog waits at the airport for 6 long years. Every single day, he sits by the same terminal doors, watching passengers come and go, never leaving his spot. Some stop to feed him, others take pictures. But no one knows why he's there or who he's waiting for. Airport workers try to help, but the dog refuses to leave, holding on to something no one understands. Then one day, everything changes. Who is he waiting for? Why has he never given up? And what happens when the truth finally comes out? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the airport parking lot as Captain Evan Rivera knelt beside his faithful companion. Riley's tail wagged with pure joy as Evan's fingers found that perfect spot behind his ears. The German shepherd's tongue lolled out, his brown eyes fixed adoringly on his owner's face, as if memorizing every detail around them. The parking lot buzzed with activity. Cars honking, luggage wheels clicking against pavement, and the distant roar of jet engines. But Riley remained focused solely on Evan, pressing closer to his side. Mark Torres shifted his weight from one foot to the other, arms crossed over his chest. "You sure about this, man?" His voice carried a note of concern. Evan adjusted the strap of his olive green duffel bag, the material worn from years of use. "He'll be fine with you," he said, though his hand lingered on Riley's fur. "I'll be back before he even realizes I'm gone." Mark nodded, his expression serious. "Don't worry about anything here. I've got this covered." He patted his leg, and Riley glanced at him briefly before turning back to Evan. "Riley and I will have a great time, won't we, boy?" Evan said, standing up slowly. "I've left his food in your apartment. 2 cups in the morning, 2 at night. He likes his evening walk around 7. Mark interrupted with a gentle smile. "I know his routine. We've gone over it 3 times. He'll be okay." Evan took a deep breath and gave Riley one final pat. "Be good, Sergeant," he whispered, using Riley's nickname from their training days. The shepherd's ears perked up at the familiar title as Evan walked toward Terminal C. Riley pulled against his leash, a high-pitched whine escaping his throat. Mark held firm, murmuring soothing words as they watched Evan pause at the entrance. He turned, offering one last wave before disappearing through the sliding glass doors. Riley's whining grew louder, his paws dancing anxiously on the pavement as he strained toward the terminal. Mark had to lean back to keep his grip on the leash. "Easy, boy," he said softly. "Easy." They stood there as Evan's plane taxied down the runway. Riley's ears followed the sound, his head tilted upward as the aircraft lifted into the sky. His eyes tracked its path until it was nothing more than a silver speck against the clouds. Later that night in Mark's apartment, Riley paced restlessly from the front door to window and back again. His food bowl sat untouched in the kitchen, the kibble growing stale in the evening air. "Come on, Riley." Mark patted the couch cushion next to him. "Come here, boy." But Riley just paused by the door, ears forward, listening intently for familiar footsteps that didn't come. When Mark tried to coax him to the bedroom for sleep, Riley simply curled up by the front door, releasing a soft, mournful whine that made Mark's heart ache. "He'll be back," Mark promised, reaching down to stroke Riley's fur. "He'll be back before you know it." Riley's only response was to press his nose closer to the crack under the door, his eyes fixed on that thin strip of hallway light, as if his whole world depended on it. 2 weeks dragged by, each day blending into the next. Mark turned his key in the lock after another long day at work, and there was Riley, exactly where he'd been every evening, stationed by the door like a faithful sentinel. The German shepherd's ears perked up at Mark's entrance, but his eyes quickly dimmed when he realized it wasn't Evan. "Come on, buddy, let's go for a walk," Mark said, reaching for the leash hanging by the door. Riley stood patiently as Mark clipped it on, but there was no excitement in his posture, none of the usual tail-wagging enthusiasm that used to accompany their evening walks. Outside, the air felt heavy with approaching rain, dark clouds gathering overhead. Riley moved with purpose down the sidewalk, his nose working overtime as he sniffed every lamppost and bush they passed. His ears remained forward, alert, as if catching fragments of distant sounds only he could hear. Mark watched as Riley paused at each corner, lifting his head to test the wind. There was something deliberate about the way he searched, as if every breath of air might carry the scent he was looking for. It wasn't just a walk anymore, it was a mission. Later that night, the storm finally broke. Thunder cracked across the sky like a whip, rattling the windows of Mark's apartment. He jolted awake to the sound of frantic scratching and desperate barking. Something felt wrong. "Riley!" Mark called out, stumbling through the dark apartment. The scratching grew more intense. When he reached the back door, his heart stopped. It stood wide open, rain and wind whipping through the gap. "Riley!" Mark rushed outside in his pajamas, instantly soaked by the downpour. "Riley!" he shouted again, his voice nearly lost in the storm. Lightning flashed briefly, illuminating the empty street. The brief burst of light showed him nothing but rain-slicked pavement and swaying trees. "Riley, come back!" Mark's calls grew more desperate as he ran down the street, checking behind parked cars and in dark corners. But the German shepherd had vanished into the night. Through the storm-swept city, Riley ran with single-minded determination. His paws splashed through puddles as he kept his nose to the ground, following a scent trail that had nearly faded with time. Cars honked as he darted between them, their headlights cutting through the rain like bright knives. The shepherd navigated a maze of streets with unwavering focus, crossing busy intersections and weaving through late-night traffic. His fur was soaked, but he didn't slow down. With each stride, each turn, each careful sniff of the air, he drew closer to his destination. The path was familiar. He'd walked it countless times with Evan. It led straight toward the airport, where he'd last seen his person disappear through those glass doors. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and purples as Riley finally reached Terminal C. His golden brown fur was matted and dripping, leaving muddy paw prints on the concrete as he padded toward the familiar glass doors. His muscles ached from running all night, but his eyes remained alert, scanning the sparse morning crowd gathering outside the terminal. This place held so many memories, the scents, the sounds, even the way the morning light reflected off the windows. It was exactly as he remembered from that day with Evan. His tail gave a tentative wag as he watched people wheeling their suitcases through the automatic doors. Each time they slid open, Riley's ears perked up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the familiar face he'd been waiting for. When Riley tried to follow a group of travelers inside, a security guard quickly stepped forward, waving his arms. "Hey, no dogs allowed inside." The guard's voice was firm but not unkind. Riley backed away, his head lowered, but his resolve unshaken. Instead of leaving, he found a spot near the large windows overlooking the runway and settled down, his gaze fixed on the terminal entrance. The morning crowd grew as the sun climbed higher. Business travelers rushed past with their coffee cups. Families hurried sleepy children toward check-in counters, and airline crew members strolled by in their crisp uniforms. Some people noticed Riley, pausing to look at the solitary shepherd sitting so still and watchful. A little girl in a pink backpack tugged at her mother's sleeve as they walked past. "Mommy, look at that dog. Why is he sitting there all alone?" she asked. Her mother glanced at Riley, noting his wet fur and patient posture. "Maybe he's waiting for someone, sweetie," she replied, giving Riley a sympathetic look before guiding her daughter toward the terminal. As the morning wore on, more people took notice of the waiting shepherd. An elderly man stopped to take a picture. A teenage boy tried to call Riley over, but the dog didn't move from his post. His eyes remained locked on the terminal doors, watching, waiting. Finally, one of the security guards, a kind-faced man with gray hair, approached Riley carefully. In his hand, he held half of his turkey sandwich. He crouched down a few feet away, holding out the offering. "Hey there, buddy, you must be hungry," he said. Riley's nose twitched at the scent of food, but he didn't move to take it. His focus never wavered from the terminal doors, his vigil unwavering. The memory of Evan walking through those doors was still fresh in his mind, and he would wait as long as it took for his person to return. The airport's bustling daytime energy faded as night crept in, leaving Terminal C in a state of hushed quiet. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as janitors pushed their mops across the gleaming floors. Inside, through the glass doors, Riley could see them working, their movements slow and methodical. A few late-night travelers wielded their bags past, their footsteps echoing in the nearly empty space. Riley's wet fur had dried throughout the day, but the evening air brought a chill that made him shiver. He curled tighter into himself, pressing close to the concrete wall near the terminal doors. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since before the storm, but leaving his post wasn't an option. Every person who walked through those doors could be Evan. Every sound could be his footsteps. The automatic doors whooshed open and closed less frequently now. A janitor's radio crackled somewhere inside. Riley's ears twitched at each new sound, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but refusing to close. Maria had just finished her shift handling baggage for the last evening flights when she spotted him. The German shepherd's noble profile caught her attention. He looked too well cared for to be a typical stray, despite his current disheveled state. She approached slowly, keeping her movements gentle and predictable. "Hey there, boy," she called softly, crouching down a few feet away. She extended her hand, palm up, clicking her tongue gently. Riley's eyes flickered to her briefly, acknowledging her presence, but quickly returned to watching the doors. His posture remained alert but unthreatening. Maria tilted her head, studying him. There was something about his patient vigilance that tugged at her heart. She reached into her lunch bag and pulled out a plastic container with leftover chicken from her dinner. "You look like you could use this more than I do," she said quietly, placing the container near him. Riley didn't move, didn't even look at the food. Maria stood slowly, brushing off her uniform pants. "Take care of yourself, buddy," she added before walking away. Only after her footsteps had faded did Riley lower his nose to investigate the offering. The smell of chicken made his stomach rumble again, and after a quick glance at the terminal doors, he began to eat. He finished quickly, licking the container clean, but never taking his eyes off the entrance for more than a few seconds. As midnight approached, the airport grew even quieter. The last flights of the day departed, their engines roaring in the distance. Inside, most of the lights dimmed to their nighttime setting, casting long shadows across the empty terminal. Riley lowered his head onto his paws, unable to fight his exhaustion any longer. He let out a soft, weary sigh, but his eyes remained open, fixed on the doors. The night stretched ahead, but Riley kept his watch, waiting for the one person who meant everything to him. Back home, Mark paced his living room. Phone pressed his ear, his free hand running through his disheveled hair. Empty coffee cups littered the coffee table. He hadn't slept since Riley disappeared. "Yes, a German shepherd," he said into the phone, his voice tight with worry. "About 6 years old, brown and black. No, he doesn't have a tag, just a military-style collar." He listened, scribbling notes on a crumpled piece of paper. "Nothing? Okay, please call if you hear anything." He hung up and immediately dialed another shelter. The same conversation played out again, ending with the same result. Mark's shoulders slumped as he added the number to his growing list of dead ends. Grabbing his car keys, he headed out for another search. The neighborhood streets were quiet in the early morning as he drove slowly, scanning every yard and alley. "Riley," he called out the window, his voice echoing off empty buildings. "Riley, come here, boy." A woman walking her dog caught his attention. He pulled over, hopping out his car. "Excuse me," he called. "Have you seen a German shepherd around here? He went missing during the storm." She shook her head sympathetically. "No, sorry. I walk here every morning and haven't seen any strays." Mark spent the rest of the day checking local parks, showing Riley's picture to anyone who would look. At the vet's office, they promised to call if anyone brought him in. Days blurred together as the search continued without success. On the fourth night, exhausted and running out of places to look, Mark stopped at a gas station to fuel up. The attendant noticed him putting up a missing dog poster. "German shepherd, you said?" The man scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Think I saw one a few days ago during that big storm." Was running full speed toward the airport. Mark's heart jumped. "The airport? You're sure?" "Pretty sure." Was distinctive looking. Military collar and all. Seemed like he knew where he was going. Hope and dread mixed in Mark's chest as he drove to the airport. The parking lot was nearly empty at this late hour, streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. He drove slowly around the perimeter, scanning every corner. Nothing. No sign of Riley. Mark parked near Terminal C, killing the engine. He sat there in the darkness, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Maybe he's gone, he whispered to the empty car, defeat heavy in his voice. Starting the engine again, he pulled away from the curb, behind a row of abandoned luggage carts. Hidden from his view, Riley lay curled up in the shadows, still keeping his faithful vigil. The morning sun crept over the airport horizon, bringing with it a surge of activity. Riley's ears twitched at the familiar symphony of rolling suitcases, clicking heels, and car horns. The smell of breakfast sandwiches and coffee wafted from the terminal, making his empty stomach growl loudly. Despite his hunger, Riley stayed put in a spot near Terminal C's entrance. His fur was still damp from the morning dew, but he barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the sliding glass doors, watching each person who walked through. A security guard in a crisp blue uniform approached, his boots clicking against the concrete. "Hey, get out of here!" He clapped his hands loudly, the sharp sound echoing off the terminal walls. Riley stood up slowly, backing away a few steps, but then sat down again, his gaze steady and determined. The guard threw up his hands. "Stubborn dog," he muttered, shaking his head as he walked away. As the morning rush picked up, travelers began to take notice of quiet German shepherd. A businessman in a dark suit paused mid-bite of his breakfast sandwich, looking from his food to Riley. After a moment's hesitation, he broke off half and tossed it over. Riley ate it quickly, but his eyes never left the terminal doors for long. A flight attendant pulling her wheeled suitcase stopped to scratch behind his ears. "Poor thing," she said softly, her gentle touch reminding Riley of easier days. But as soon as she walked away, his focus returned to his vigil. Hours passed, and Riley became part of the terminal's landscape. Regular airport workers grew used to his presence, the quiet dog who watched and waited. Some would nod in his direction. Others would leave scraps of food, but all seemed to sense there was something special about his patient vigilance. As the afternoon sun began to dip, Maria appeared. Her orange safety vest was bright against the gray terminal walls. This time, she carried 2 bowls, one filled with water, the other with brown kibble. She set them down carefully near Riley. "You're really not leaving, huh?" she murmured, crouching beside him. Riley turned his head to look at her, his brown eyes deep in knowing, before returning his gaze to the terminal. Doors still waiting. The days blended together at the airport, each one much like the last. Riley had fallen into a routine, patrolling perimeter of Terminal C in the early morning hours when the crowds were thin. He'd pause to watch each plane land, his ears perking up at the roar of engines before returning to his post near the sliding doors. Airport staff had grown used to his presence. Security guards no longer tried to chase him away, and the maintenance crew would leave their door propped open on cold nights, providing him shelter from the wind. Even the coffee cart vendors saved him bits of breakfast sandwiches. One sunny afternoon, Maria sat down on the concrete next to Riley during her lunch break. She unwrapped her sandwich, tearing off a piece for him as she watched him eat. Her eyes fell on his worn collar. "Military style, huh?" She reached out slowly, letting her fingers trace the tough fabric. Riley didn't flinch away. He'd grown to trust her gentle presence. Maria smiled, noticing how he sat straight and alert, like a soldier at attention. "You know what?" she said, taking another bite of her sandwich. "You look like a tough guy. I'm calling you Sergeant." Riley's ears twitched at the name, and Maria laughed. "Yeah, that fits you perfectly." The nickname spread quickly through the airport staff. "Morning, Sergeant." The baggage handlers would call out, "At ease, Sergeant." The security guards would joke as they passed by. Even regular travelers began to recognize him, pointing him out to their children. "Look," they call him Sergeant. One afternoon, a young woman with a pink phone case stopped to take Riley's picture as he lay in his usual spot, head held high, watching the terminal doors. She typed quickly on her phone and then walked away. Hours later, Maria was scrolling through her social media feed when she saw the photo. There was Riley, looking noble and patient, with the caption, "This dog has been sitting at the airport for weeks. Who is he waiting for?" The post was already gathering attention. Comments poured in, people sharing their own photos of Riley and asking questions about the mysterious dog who never left his post. Maria walked over to where Riley lay, his eyes fixed as always on the terminal doors. She knelt beside him, giving him a gentle pat. "Looks like you're famous now, Sergeant," she said softly. Riley glanced at her briefly before returning to his watchful vigil, seemingly uninterested in his growing internet fame. The years shifted like passengers through the terminal. Summer's heat gave way to autumn's chill, and still Riley remained. His once glossy coat had dulled, carrying streaks of gray and dirt that even the rain couldn't wash away. His ribs showed more prominently now, despite the regular meals from kind-hearted staff members. Yet his eyes never lost their spark of hope. Each morning, he'd lift his head at the sound of the first arrival, scanning faces in the crowd. Each night, he'd curl up in a spot, waiting for tomorrow. The airport community had fully embraced him. Security guards who once shooed him away now greeted him with gentle pats. Maria brought him fresh water twice during her shifts. The coffee shop workers saved their leftover breakfast sandwiches for him. When the first cold snap hit, a flight attendant named Jenny brought a thick blue blanket from home. "Here you go, Sergeant," she said softly, laying it near his usual spot. Riley sniffed it carefully before settling onto its warmth. One crisp morning, a man in a press suit noticed Riley during his layover. Sam Harper, a journalist known for human interest stories, watched as the German shepherd maintained his silent vigil. Something about the dog's unwavering presence touched him. "How long has he been here?" Sam asked Maria, who was passing by with her luggage cart. 6 years now," she replied, her voice soft with concern. "He never really leaves Terminal C." Sam spent his 3-hour layover talking to airport staff, gathering their stories about Riley. He learned about the military collar, the daily routines, and the countless travelers who tried and failed to coax him home. The next morning, Sam's article appeared in the local paper and online. "The dog at Gate 12, 6 years of waiting." The piece painted a touching portrait of Riley's dedication, describing his daily vigil and the community that had formed around him. As the morning sun streamed to the terminal windows, Riley lay in his usual spot near the doors. A flight had just landed, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the terminal. His ears perked up at the familiar sound of boots on the pavement, that distinct military cadence he knew so well. Riley lifted his head, flickering in his eyes as he watched the approaching figure. But it wasn't Evan. His tail, which had begun to rise slowly, lowered back down with a soft sigh. He rested his head on his paws, eyes fixed once again on the terminal doors, still waiting. Sam Harper leaned back in his office chair, his coffee growing cold beside his keyboard. The article about Riley stared back at him from his computer screen. He'd written hundreds of stories in his career, but something about this one felt different. His finger hovered over the publish button. The dog at Gate 12. 6 years of waiting wasn't just another piece. It was a story of loyalty that struck deep into the heart. Sam had captured every detail, from Riley's military-style collar to his daily routines, from the kindness of the airport staff to the unwavering dedication in those patient brown eyes. With a deep breath, he clicked publish. Within hours, the comments started flooding in. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications. By afternoon, the story had been shared thousands of times. "This broke my heart," one comment read. "Someone must know who he belongs to," said another. "I'll adopt him," many offered. Local news stations picked up the story first, then regional ones. Soon, Riley's story was spreading across the country. People tagged their military friends, hoping someone might recognize the loyal German shepherd. The airport social media team responded to the surge of interest, explaining that Riley couldn't be adopted. "He has a mission," they wrote. "He won't leave his post." A news van pulled up to the airport the next morning. The reporter, a young woman in a blue blazer, interviewed Maria near Terminal C. Riley lay in his usual spot, seemingly unaware of his growing fame. "We just call him Sergeant now," Maria explained, her voice soft but clear. The camera panned to Riley, who kept a steady gaze on the terminal doors. "He's waiting for someone. I don't think he'll leave until they come." The segment aired that evening, bringing another wave of attention. Social media lit up with hashtags like hashtag waiting dog and hashtag sergeant. People shared their own stories of loyal pets, but none quite matched Riley's dedication. That night, Maria finished her late shift, pushing her empty luggage cart past Terminal C. The crowds had thinned, leaving the terminal quiet except for the hum of cleaning machines and distant announcements. Riley lay in his usual spot, his blue blanket bunched beneath him. The camera crews and curious onlookers had all gone home, but he remained unchanged by his newfound fame. Maria knelt beside him, her hand gently stroking his fur. "You're famous now, buddy," she whispered. Riley barely acknowledged her presence. His eyes remained fixed on the terminal doors, patient and unwavering, still waiting. Mark sat alone in the corner of the busy coffee shop, absently stirring his third cup of the morning. His phone buzzed with news notifications. He usually ignored them, but something caught his eye. His hand trembled as he read the headline. The loyal dog who never left the airport. His coffee splashed over the rim as he clicked the link. The article loaded, revealing a photo that made his chest tighten. There, sitting outside Terminal C, was an older, thinner version of Riley. The German shepherd's muzzle had grayed, but those eyes, those determined, patient eyes, were unmistakable. "No way," Mark muttered, drawing concerned glances from nearby customers. He read through the article twice, each word hitting him like a punch to the gut. 6 years. Riley had been at the airport for 6 years, waiting faithfully while Mark had given up searching. After just a few months, he left his coffee half-finished, nearly knocking over his chair as he rushed out. The drive to the airport felt endless. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, guilt pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He should have looked harder, should have checked the airport, should have known Riley would go back to where he last saw Evan. The morning sun cast long shadows across the terminal as Mark parked his car. His legs felt heavy as he walked toward Terminal C, scanning the area. Then he saw him. Riley was curled up near the automatic doors, just as in the photo. "Riley," Mark called out, his voice cracking. The old dog lifted his head slowly, ears twitching at the familiar voice. But there was no excitement in his eyes, no recognition. He simply watched as Mark approached, as if he were just another stranger passing through. "Mark." Mark crouched beside him, fighting back tears. "It's me, bud," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Come home." Riley's gaze drifted from Mark to the terminal doors, then back again. His message was clear as day. "Not you. I'm waiting for someone else." Mark's vision blurred as tears welled up. In that moment, he finally understood. Riley had never been waiting for him. All these years, through rain, snow, and summer heat, Riley had been waiting for Evan. Only Evan. The autumn wind whistled through Terminal C, rustling fallen leaves across the concrete. Riley's coat, now streaked with more gray than brown, ruffled in the breeze as he maintained his faithful vigil. 1 year had passed since he first arrived, and the airport had become his home. Though home wasn't quite the right word. It was more like a waiting room, a temporary stop on the way to somewhere else. The airport staff had grown used to his presence. Some even considered him their unofficial mascot. Janitors would sweep around him carefully, and security guards nodded in his direction during their rounds. His story had spread far beyond the airport walls, touching hearts across the country. One morning, a traveler wielding her luggage past Riley stopped. She returned an hour later with a plush dog bed, tears in her eyes as she handed it to Maria. "I saw the story online," she explained. "He shouldn't have to sleep on the concrete." Maria placed the bed near Riley's usual spot, right where he could keep watch over the terminal doors. He sniffed it cautiously before settling in. His eyes never left the entrance. Throughout the day, different airport workers tried to engage with him. Tommy from baggage claim tossed a tennis ball, which Riley watched bounce past without interest. Sarah from the coffee shop attempted to teach him to shake hands. But after a brief moment of interaction, Riley turned his attention back to the doors. Online, Riley's story continued to touch people's hearts. Social media buzzed with updates and photos shared by travelers passing through. But lately, the tone of some comments had shifted from admiration to concern. "This dog is aging," one comment read beneath a recent photo. "How much longer will he wait?" Others chimed in. Someone needs to help him move on. It's been years. This isn't healthy anymore. That night, as the terminal grew quiet and the last flights departed, Maria found Riley shivering, despite his new bed. His bones seemed more prominent under his fur, and his breathing seemed more labored than usual. The sight made her heart ache. She knelt beside him, carefully wrapping a thick blanket around his shoulders. Riley accepted her touch, but his eyes remained fixed on those automatic doors, just as they had been for the past year. "You don't have to keep waiting," she whispered gently, stroking his graying fur. Her voice was soft, meant only for him. "Whoever it is, I think they want you to be happy." Riley let out a deep sigh, but didn't move. The determination in his eyes hadn't dimmed, even as his body showed signs of aging. He simply adjusted his position slightly, settled deeper into his bed, and continued his watch. Maria stayed with him for a while longer, her hand resting on his back, feeling each breath rise and fall. The terminal lights cast long shadows across the floor, and somewhere in the distance, a plane took off into the night sky. On the other side of the world, the fluorescent lights hummed softly in the rehabilitation center as Evan Rivera opened his eyes. His fingers traced the faded scars on his face in the small mirror propped against the windowsill. 6 years. The thought made his stomach twist. 6 years of his life gone while he recovered from injuries and struggled through the fog of memory loss in this foreign facility. The face staring back at him looked older, weathered. His dark hair had touches of gray at the temples now, and lines creased the corners of his eyes. But it was his own face again, not the confused stranger he'd been for so long. The door creaked open, and a military official in a crisp uniform entered. "Captain Rivera," the man said, holding a folder. "We're sending you home." Evan's breath caught in his throat. Home. The word felt strange, almost foreign after so long. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the papers. The flight back to the U.S. passed in a blur. When he landed, the world felt both familiar and alien. Everything had changed while he was gone. His parents had moved to Florida. Old friends had scattered across the country. His phone calls went unanswered, except for Mark's. They met at a small diner near the airport. Mark couldn't meet his eyes, his fingers tapping nervously on the table between them. The guilt radiated off him in waves. "There's something you need to see," Mark said quietly, pulling out his phone. His hand shook as he passed it to Evan. Evan looked at the screen and felt his world stop. There was Riley, his loyal companion, but so different now. His muzzle was gray, his body thinner. He sat outside what looked like airport doors, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. The headline above the photo read, "The dog at gate 12, 6 months of waiting." Evan's vision blurred with tears. His fingers tightened around the phone. "Where is he?" Evan whispered. "The airport," Mark whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He never left." Without another word, Evan bolted from his chair. He ran to his rental car, his heart pounding against his ribs. His hands shook as he started the engine, pointing the car toward Terminal C. Evan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tight, his knuckles turned white. The rental car's engine hummed as he pressed the accelerator, weaving through traffic with desperate urgency. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat seeming to echo Riley's name. 6 years. 6 years of waiting. Streetlights blurred past as thoughts raced through his mind. The last time he'd seen Riley, healthy younger, his fur still rich and dark, seemed both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. The image from Mark's phone haunted him. Riley's graying muzzle, his thin frame, those patient eyes still fixed on the terminal doors. Mark sat beside him in tense silence, his shoulders hunched with the weight of guilt. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought he was gone," he said, staring at his hands. "I looked everywhere, Evan. I didn't know." Evan couldn't respond. His throat felt too tight. Memories flooded his mind. Riley nudging his hand during their morning walks. How his ears would perk up at the sound of Evan's voice. How he'd curl up at the foot of the bed every night. Each memory brought a fresh wave of pain and longing. As they turned onto the airport access road, a terrifying thought struck Evan. What if Riley didn't recognize him? 6 years was a lifetime for a dog. He'd aged, changed. They both had. What if he looked too different now? What if the scars on his face, the gray in his hair, made him a stranger to the one soul who'd never stopped waiting for him? The airport's bright lights came into view. Evan's hands trembled on the wheel as they approached Terminal C. He didn't even wait for the car to fully stop. He threw into park and jumped out, his boots hitting the pavement hard. His eyes scanned the area frantically, moving past the scattered travelers, the luggage carts, the security guards. Then he saw it, a familiar shape, lying near the terminal doors. A German shepherd, older now, but unmistakable. It was him, Riley. Riley's head rested on his worn blanket, his breath slow and steady in the quiet night air. Though his body had grown weary with age, his senses remained sharp, always alert for that one special sound. He'd waited so long to hear it. His ears twitched at the approaching footsteps. He'd learned to recognize the different gates of security guards, travelers, and airport staff, but these steps were different. Something stirred in his old bones as a scent caught his attention, faint but achingly familiar. His nose twitched, and his tired eyes opened wider. Evan stood frozen, several feet away, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sight of Riley, older, grayer, but still unmistakably his faithful companion, made his throat tight with emotion. His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. Riley. The German shepherd's body went completely still. His ears stood straight up, and his nose worked frantically at the air. Slowly, he turned his head toward the sound of that voice, the voice he'd waited 6 long years to hear again. Their eyes met across the terminal floor. Riley's cloudy brown eyes locked onto Evan's face for a moment. Time seemed to stop. Then something extraordinary happened, like a surge of youth flowing through his aging body. Riley sprang to his feet. Despite his arthritic joints and weathered frame, he launched himself forward with the energy of a much younger dog. His bark echoed through the terminal, a hoarse, joyful sound that was half bark, half cry. He crashed into Evan with such force that his handler tumbled backward onto the floor. Riley's tail whipped back and forth with wild abandon as he pressed himself against Evan's chest, pawing at him, whimpering with uncontained joy. Evan wrapped his arms around Riley's neck, burying his face in the dog's fur. Tears streamed down his face as he held his faithful friend. "You waited," he choked out, pressing his forehead against Riley's. "You really waited." Around them, the airport had gone quiet. Travelers stopped in their tracks, watching the reunion unfold. Maria stood nearby, wiping tears from her cheeks as she witnessed a moment she'd somehow always known would come. Mark remained a few steps back, drawing in a shaky breath as he watched. Riley showered Evan's face with frantic licks, his paws still pressing against Evan's chest as if making sure his person was really there. The wait was finally over. Hours later, the soft glow of a lamp filled Evan's old apartment, casting warm shadows across the worn furniture. Riley lay curled up on the floor between Evan and Mark, his chest rising and falling in deep, peaceful breaths. For the first time in 6 years, the German shepherd slept without stirring at every sound, without keeping one eye fixed on the door. Evan couldn't stop watching him, his fingers moving gently through Riley's fur, noting the gray around his muzzle, the slight thinness that years of waiting had etched into his frame. "I should have been here," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. Mark shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly. He shook his head, his own eyes fixed on Riley's sleeping form. "We all thought you were gone," he said, his voice cracking slightly. The report said they were so sure. The two men sat in silence for a moment, listening to Riley's soft snores. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but neither made a move to leave. "Tell me everything," Evan said quietly. "About when he ran away. About the airport." Mark leaned forward, rubbing his face. He knew exactly where Riley was going, straight back to Terminal C, where he last saw Evan. "Nothing I did could make him leave," he paused, swallowing hard. "He just waited through everything. Rain, snow, summer heat. The airport staff started looking after him, but he never really connected with anyone. He was just waiting. I never stopped thinking about him either," Evan admitted. "Even when I couldn't remember my own name, I had these fragments, the feel of her under my hands, the sound of panting, a tail wagging. He smiled sadly. Maybe we were both waiting in our own ways. They talked through the night, piecing together the years they'd lost, about the rehabilitation center, where Evan had slowly recovered his memories, about Mark's desperate searches for Riley, about the community that had formed around the loyal dog who never gave up hope. When morning came, streams of sunlight filtered through the blinds. Evan had dozed off on the couch, but something familiar pulled him from sleep. A soft whine reached his ears, followed by the gentle pressure of a cold nose against his palm. His eyes opened to find Riley there, tail wagging slowly, looking at him with complete devotion. Evan's heart swelled as he reached out to scratch behind Riley's ears. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his voice rough with sleep. "We're home." Riley's tail wagged faster at the sound of his voice. As Evan stood up from the couch, Riley rose too, though his movements were a bit stiff from age. His eyes shone with trust and contentment. For the first time in 6 years, he didn't glance at the door. He didn't need to wait anymore. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Evan and Riley settled into their new routine. Each morning began with Riley's gentle nudge, his tail wagging at the sight of Evan awake and present. Though the German shepherd moved more slowly now, his devotion remained unchanged. They spent their mornings in the park, Riley padding along at Evan's side. His gait wasn't as steady as it once had been, but his eyes sparkled with contentment. Sometimes they'd rest on a bench, Evan's hand buried in Riley's fur, watching the world go by. Other times, they'd sit on the front porch of Evan's apartment, Riley dozing in the sun while Evan read. The familiar sights and sounds of their life together filled the empty spaces that 6 years had carved between them. Riley no longer startled at sudden noises or kept vigil by the door. Instead, he followed Evan from room to room with peaceful assurance, as if making up for lost time. One crisp morning, Evan drove them to the airport. Terminal C looked different in the daylight, less imposing than it had been on that rainy night of their reunion. Riley sat calmly in the passenger seat, his head tilted as he watched the familiar building. Maria was there, organizing luggage carts. When she spotted them, her face lit up with recognition as she approached, crouching down to Riley's level. "Well, look who it is," she said warmly, giving Riley a gentle pat on the head. "Our faithful sergeant." Evan smiled, watching as Riley leaned into her touch. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for looking after him all those years." Maria stood up, brushing off her uniform. "He really never left, huh?" she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. 6 years, right there by those doors. She gestured toward Terminal C, where Riley had kept his endless vigil. Other airport staff members who recognized Riley stopped by to say hello. They shared stories of the loyal dog who had become part of their daily lives. How he'd weathered storms, how he politely accepted food but never moved from his post, how he'd watched every arriving passenger with unwavering hope. Evan listened to their stories, his hand resting on Riley's back. He looked down at his faithful companion, now sitting contentedly beside him. He felt a profound understanding wash over him. While Riley had been waiting all those years, Evan had been waiting too, through the fog of injury and memory loss, through the long days of rehabilitation, through the confusion of finding his way back home. As they prepared to leave, Riley paused near the terminal doors. He turned his head, taking one final look at the spot where he had spent so many days and nights. His tail wagged gently, and then with quiet certainty, he turned back to Evan and followed him home. The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting Evan's modest house in warm golden hues. On the wooden porch, Riley lay stretched out, his gray-flecked muzzle resting on his paws. Though his eyes were closed, his ears twitched to every sound, the chirping birds, rustling leaves, and the familiar footsteps of Evan moving around inside. Through the kitchen window, Evan watched his faithful companion, while the coffee maker hummed. Steam rose from his cup as he observed Riley's peaceful form, noting how different it was from the anxious vigilance that had marked their years apart. No more waiting by terminal doors or scanning crowds. Riley was finally home. Their days settled into a comfortable rhythm that suited them both. Each morning, Evan woke to find Riley already alert, tail thumping against the floor in greeting. Their walks became shorter now, adjusted to accommodate Riley's aging joints. But the German shepherd still approached each outing with quiet enthusiasm. He would pause often to investigate interesting scents, his nose working carefully while Evan waited patiently beside him. During the afternoons, they claimed the porch as their sanctuary. Evan would settle into his chair with a book, while Riley sprawled nearby in patches of sunlight. Sometimes, neighbors would pass by, waving hello, and Riley's tail would wag in gentle acknowledgement. The hours passed peacefully, marked by the steady sound of Riley's breathing and the occasional turn of a page. Nighttime brought its own comfort. Riley no longer paced or winded doors. Instead, he curled up on his bed near Evan's, falling into deep, contented sleep. Despite the gray in his fur and the slight stiffness in his movements, Riley's joy showed clearly in the constant motion of his tail, whenever Evan was near. One quiet evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon. Riley's head rested heavily on Evan's knee, his eyes half closed in contentment, running his fingers through the dog's soft fur. Evan felt the weight of their lost years. "I should come home sooner," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the evening crickets. Riley released a gentle sigh, pressing closer to Evan's leg. In the dog's simple world, there was no concept of the time they'd lost, only the perfect certainty that his person was here now, and that was all that mattered. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Evan prepared Riley's breakfast. He noticed something was different when Riley didn't come padding in at the sound of kibble hitting his bowl. Instead, the German shepherd remained in his bed, eyes open but hesitant to move. "Riley?" Evan called softly, crossing the room to kneel beside him. "What's wrong, buddy?" Riley's tail gave a weak thump against the cushion, but when he tried to stand, his legs trembled with effort. His breathing came in shallow pants, and Evan could see the stiffness in his joints as the dog struggled to rise. Without a moment's hesitation, Evan grabbed his keys and wallet. "It's okay, boy. I've got you," he whispered, gently sliding his arms under Riley's body and lifting him as carefully as possible. Riley whimpered softly, and the sound made Evan's heart clench. The drive to the veterinary clinic was tense, with Evan constantly glancing at Riley in the passenger seat. The old dog lay quietly, his head resting on the worn leather, eyes fixed on Evan as always. In the examination room, Dr. Sarah Martinez moved with gentle efficiency. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her hands were gentle as she examined Riley, checking his joints, listening to his heart, and feeling along his spine. Riley remained still, accepting her touch with quiet dignity. "He's been through a lot," she said finally, her kind eyes meeting Evan's worried gaze. She explained how the years of exposure to the elements, the irregular meals, and the stress of waiting had accelerated Riley's aging process. His body was wearing down faster than it should have. The fact that he held on for so long amazed Dr. Martinez. "That kind of dedication, that's rare," she said softly. "You gave him a reason to keep going." She patted Riley's head gently. "But he's tired now." Evan stood beside the examination table, his hand resting on Riley's head, fingers scratching gently behind his ears, the way Riley had always loved. "I just want to make sure he's happy," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The drive home was quiet. Riley lay in the passenger seat, his breathing steady but labored. Evan kept one hand on the steering wheel, while the other reached over to scratch behind Riley's ears. The familiar streets passed by as Evan's mind raced with memories of their first meeting, their separation, and their reunion. "Whatever time we have left, buddy," he whispered, glancing at his faithful friend, "we'll make it count." The morning bathed the wooden porch in golden light, warming Riley's aging body as he lay in his favorite spot. His chest rose and fell with slow, steady breaths, each one a little more labored than the last. When Evan stepped outside with his morning coffee, Riley's tail thumped softly against the weather boards, a gentle reminder of the joy that had never left him, even in his weakened state. Evan sat beside him, running his fingers through Riley's graying fur. The German shepherd leaned into his touch, closing his eyes in contentment. They stayed like that for a while, sharing the quiet morning together. That afternoon, Evan carefully lifted Riley into the passenger seat of his truck. The old dog didn't protest, trusting his person completely. As they drove, Evan kept one hand on Riley's back, feeling the familiar warmth beneath his palm. The airport came into view, Terminal C standing just as it had all those years. Maria waited near the entrance, her work vest bright against the afternoon sun. When she saw them pull up, her eyes immediately went to Riley. Evan helped Riley out of the truck, supporting him as the old dog's paws touched the familiar concrete. Maria knelt beside them, tears already forming in her eyes as she reached out to touch Riley's head. "Hey, Sergeant," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You made it home." Riley's tail wagged slowly at her familiar voice. Evan guided him to his old spot near the terminal doors, where he had spent 6 long years waiting. Riley settled down with a soft sigh, his eyes scanning the busy terminal, his ears twitching at the sound of planes taking off and landing, sounds that had been the backdrop to his faithful vigil. Travelers passed by, many of them regulars who recognized the famous waiting dog. Some stopped, kneeling to say goodbye to the airport's most loyal visitor. A flight attendant, who had often brought him treats, wiped away tears as she patted his head. An older security guard, who had watched over him on cold nights, stood quietly nearby, nodding respectfully to Evan. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Evan gently lifted Riley into his arms. The dog rested his head against Evan's shoulder, tired but content. They both looked back at Terminal C for the last time, the spot where their story had begun and ended and begun again. "Let's go home, boy," Evan whispered, carrying Riley back to the truck. The night settled softly around Evan's small house, stars twinkling in the clear sky above. The porch creaked gently as Evan settled into his wooden chair, the familiar sound mixing with the chorus of crickets and distant rustling leaves. Riley lay beside him, his gray muzzle resting against Evan's leg, just as he had done countless times before. The old German shepherd's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, his fur now more silver than black. It felt soft under Evan's gentle touch. Time had changed them both, but the bond between them remained unbreakable. "You did good, Riley," Evan murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His fingers traced a familiar path behind Riley's ears, finding the spots that always made his tail thump softly against the porch boards. "Better than I ever deserved." The night air carried the scent of blooming jasmine from the garden, a garden Riley had watched Evan plant just weeks ago. The dog's eyes were half closed now, peaceful and content, his body pressed against Evan's leg, seeking the warmth and presence of his person, making sure Evan was still there. Evan kept talking, his voice steady despite the tears gathering in his eyes. Each word carried years of love, gratitude, and understanding. "You can rest now," he said softly, continuing to stroke Riley's fur. "You did what you came to do." The wind whispered through the trees, gentle and calm. Stars sparkled overhead, witnesses to this quiet moment between a man and his faithful friend. In that peaceful silence, with his best friend beside him, Riley took his final breath. The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting Evan's house in shades of amber and gold. The light spilled across the wooden porch boards, illuminating the empty space beside Evan's chair, where Riley had always sat. The silence felt different now, heavier, more complete. Evan's fingers gripped the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white. The morning birds sang their usual songs, but without Riley's ears perking up at their calls. The melody seemed hollow. The neighborhood was waking up, cars starting, doors closing, people calling out morning greetings. But on Evan's porch, time stood still. Inside the house, his movements were mechanical, muscle memory carrying him through a routine that suddenly felt foreign. The coffee maker hummed to life, and Evan found himself pausing, waiting for the familiar click of paws on hardwood that always followed the sound. But there was only silence. Steam rose from his coffee mug. As he stepped back onto the porch, his eyes drifted to the spot where Riley had taken his final breath just hours ago. The blanket still lay there, rumpled and empty. Evan's legs felt heavy as he knelt beside it, his hand trembling as it brushed across the soft fabric. Riley's scent lingered, that mixture of outdoors and warmth that had always meant home. The grief hit him in waves, sharp and raw, making his chest tight and his eyes burn. But beneath the pain, there was something else, a profound gratitude that made his heart swell. "You waited for me, buddy," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll carry you with me now." The morning stretched on, each minute marked by the absence of Riley's presence. No tail thumping against the floor, no gentle whine asking for breakfast, no warm body leaning against his leg as he sat in his chair. When Mark's truck pulled up later that day, the sun was high in the sky. He climbed the porch steps slowly, hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his shoulders heavy with shared grief. Without a word, he settled into the chair next to Evan. They sat there together, two men bound by loss and love, watching the quiet road ahead. No words were needed. They both understood what they had lost. The empty space beside Evan's chair said more than words ever could. A week passed like a slow-moving fog, each day blending into the next. When Evan's phone rang that morning, Maria's voice carried a hint of something that made him sit up straighter. "You should come to the airport," she said, her tone warm but serious. The drive to the airport felt different now. No eager companion in the passenger seat, no rhythmic panting filling the silence, just memories and an ache that hadn't quite dulled. As Evan pulled into the familiar parking lot, he noticed a small crowd gathered near Terminal C. Their voices were hushed, respectful, like visitors in a sacred place. Some held phones, taking pictures. Others just stood quietly, looking at something on the wall. Maria waited for him near the entrance, her work vest reflecting the morning sun. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears as she took his arm. "Come on," she said softly. "There's something you need to see." The crowd parted as they approached, whispers of recognition rippling through the gathered people. There, mounted on the wall near the doors where Riley had spent so many days waiting, was a bronze plaque. Evan's breath caught in his throat. The metal gleamed in the sunlight, every detail perfect. Riley's image was captured in stunning detail, standing tall, alert, waiting. His ears were perked forward, his posture proud, just as Evan remembered him. Below the image, the words were etched deep and clear. For 6 years he waited. Love never forgets. Evan's hand trembled as he reached out to touch the cool metal surface. His fingers traced the outline of Riley's face, feeling the smooth curves and edges that somehow captured his faithful companion's spirit perfectly. His chest tightened with emotion. He'd hate all this attention. Evan managed to chuckle, though his voice was thick with emotion. The thought of Riley's modest nature, how he'd never wanted anything but to wait for his person, made the moment even more poignant. Maria stood beside him, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Maybe," she agreed softly, "but he deserves it." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching as people came and went. Some stopped to take pictures. Others just paused to read the plaque. Each person seemed touched by the simple message of loyalty and love. A young boy walked past with his father. His small hand pointed up at the plaque with curiosity. "Who's that dog, Daddy?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly in the terminal. The father knelt beside his son, looking up at Riley's image with a gentle smile. "That's Riley," he explained. "He waited for someone he loved, and he never gave up." The morning sun cast long shadows across the airport parking lot as Evan sat in his truck, hands resting on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, he could see Terminal C, the place that had been both a beginning and an end. The glass doors gleamed differently now, no longer holding the weight of endless waiting and loss. People streamed in and out of the terminal, their luggage wheels clicking against the pavement. Some paused to look at the new bronze plaque. Their faces softened as they read the words. Evan watched them, feeling a strange peace settle over him. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out Riley's old collar. The leather was worn smooth from years of use, the metal buckled but still strong. His thumb traced over the scratches and marks, each one a story, a moment shared between a man and his dog. The collar had survived 6 years of waiting, just like Riley had. "I think you would have liked this ending, buddy," Evan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the quiet cab of his truck, honest and raw, with gentle movements. He stepped out of the vehicle. The morning air was crisp, carrying the familiar sounds of the airport. Jet engines, distant announcements, the constant hum of life moving forward. His boots made steady sounds against the pavement as he approached the plaque. The bronze caught the sunlight. Riley's image, as faithful in metal as he had been in life. Evan's hands were steady as he lifted the collar with careful movements. He draped it over one corner of the plaque. The worn leather settled against the bronze like it belonged there, like this had always been its destination. He stepped back, taking in the sight. The collar hung there, a simple testament to a bond that had defied time and distance. Around him, the airport continued its endless rhythm, but this small corner held something timeless. Without hesitation, without looking back, Evan turned and walked toward the exit. His steps were sure and unburdened. For the first time since finding Riley again, he didn't feel the need to glance over his shoulder. As he drove home, he rolled down the window. A gentle breeze swept through the truck, ruffling his hair. Evan smiled faintly, the expression soft and genuine. In the wind, he could almost hear it, that familiar, comforting sound of Riley's tags jingling, like an echo of memories carried in the air. The autumn leaves crunched beneath Evan's boots as he walked through the park. The morning was quiet, peaceful, the kind of day that made the memories feel less like wounds and more like treasured photographs, worn but precious. The ache of losing Riley was still there, a constant companion, but it had softened around the edges. Up ahead, a group of people in bright volunteer T-shirts bustled around folding tables and pop-up kennels. Signs announcing a local shelter adoption event fluttered in the breeze. Evan hadn't planned to stop. He hadn't even known about the event, but something made his feet slow. The volunteers moved with cheerful efficiency, setting up water bowls and arranging leashes. Dogs of all sizes peered out from their temporary enclosures, some barking excitedly, others watching the activity with quiet curiosity. That's when he saw her, a medium-sized mixed breed with patchy brown fur and eyes that seemed to hold worlds of patience. She sat quietly in her kennel, neither demanding attention nor shrinking from it. When their eyes met, something familiar stirred in Evan's chest. He found himself walking closer, drawn by those warm brown eyes. Kneeling down beside her kennel, he held out his hand. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice gentle. The dog tilted her head, studying him for a moment, before stretching her nose forward. She sniffed his fingers carefully, then gave them a tentative lick. Her tail began to wag, slow but steady. A volunteer in a faded blue shirt approached, smiling as she watched their interaction. "She's been waiting a while," she said, her voice kind. "Most people want puppies or purebreds." The words hit Evan like a physical thing. Waiting, such a simple word, but it carried so much weight. He looked back at the dog, really looked at her. Behind the cautious hope in her eyes, he saw something he recognized, the quiet dignity of a heart that knew how to wait. After a long moment, he nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "Let's go home." As they walked away from the adoption event, his new companion padding quietly beside him, Evan tilted his face toward the sky. The clouds drifted overhead, white and peaceful against the blue. For the first time since losing Riley, he felt truly at peace. And somewhere, in a place beyond time, Riley was watching. If you enjoyed the story of Riley and Evan, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.